microphone, and luckily I have a really soft voice. Welcome. This forum is part of the First Fridays Colloquium for the Social Justice major. How many of you are coming here from SJC? Woo! So welcome to all of you. We're really excited for the panel today. If you're interested in learning more about the Social Justice and Cultural Studies major, we have handouts, and then we also have definitions to help you with the panel today on sexuality and gender. And then, oh yes, okay, and if you would like to go on the Morocco Study Abroad program, we also have flyers for that. So Andy will be introducing our panel today, but welcome to you all.
Hello, everybody. Is everybody having a good Friday?
Woo! Yes.
Hold on. Slow energies. Winter sweater. Still there. Okay. Hello. Welcome to this colloquium. For the scheduling for today, how we're going to plan it out is get it started with our amazing Dr. Scheffler, who is a professor in the biology department. Period. And she's also one of the leaders in just in feminism in many different ways in the biology department, has a voice, represents a lot of students who might not be heard in their classroom. We see a lot of different departments where if you're in the sociology department, if you're in a class that kind of talks about feminism in a very open way, it's easy to be bringing your experiences, being who you are, but in biology, bringing in the STEM departments, it might take a while. And having amazing professors to be able to speak and be in these spaces and the classrooms is a big value to us. And after, while Scheffler is beginning, we will have Wiley. So sorry. one of the other leaders in this Taylor from the Social Justice Committee was in contact, so something like that, is one of the leaders and the co-founder of the Gender Justice League, and is going to be presenting on the politics around transgender history in modern ways. And then we will have our three panelists. Dr. Bailey of the English department and the Cultural Studies department, Dr. Koenig in the Theology department, and Dr. Mondesir in the Sociology department. And then afterwards we'll conclude with Q&A where you can ask all the speakers today any questions you might have. And thank you guys all for coming. Dr. Scheffler, please start.
Thanks.
So I just have a few things to talk to you about, and I guess my overarching goal is just to give you a sense that biology is not fixed, and I think that that's something that people often harken back to. What is in your genes makes you who you are. It's the recipe that decides your life for you. And I hope what I'm going to argue a little bit is that your biology and your genes are interacting with each other all the time, and particularly during development. And so that gives bodies a lot of flexibility, and it gives brains a lot of flexibility. And I think that when we're talking about biological sex in particular, there are lots of options. And I'm just going to give you guys a little bit of a taste of some of those pathways. If the technology will work a little bit for us today. So these are some terms. I wasn't exactly sure what everybody's background would be. I know you guys get to take a biology class as part of your liberal arts experience, and so here's just a little bit of review of some of those terms. So chromosomes are the name that we give the housing for genes. And does anyone know how many chromosomes humans often have? Yeah, in a gamete, so in a sperm or an egg, you're going to have somewhere around 22, 23, or 24. And And in a cell outside of that, like the skin cells that you can touch or something like that, you're going to usually have around 46 chromosomes. And there's lots of information there, and they have different shapes, and they can do super cool things. My favorite is that white blood cells use them as lassos, and so they actually toss your chromosomes outside of the cell and grab things and then rope them back in, which is a super underappreciated job for chromosomes. But they also tell a lot of information and basically give your cells things to do. We also have gonads, and gonads are a group of tissue inside people's bodies that make gametes, the sperm or the egg, and we have options for what gonads look like. Ovaries are groups of cells, a type of tissue that tends to make follicles, which are going to be the nutrient-supplying egg cells. And we have testes that make a very nutrient non-rich little cell called sperm. And we also have a bunch of tubes around these gonads that take the gametes to someplace outside of the body. And we call these little tubes either a fallopian or a uterine tube, or a vas or ductus deferens. Those of you who might have taken like sex ed in 5th grade, you might have talked about fallopian tubes and vas deferens. And in anatomy and physiology today, we try to move away from names for people who discover things, and we try to give names to structures for what they actually do for bodies. And so right now in the literature, you tend to see things like uterine tubes and ductus deferens because that gives you a little bit more clues about what their actions and things are in the body. And then you have a uterus, which often goes with an opening to the outside world called a vagina, and a penis, which is usually housed outside of the body. And so these are options for parts of anatomy that do tasks for bodies. And one of the things I'm going to argue today is because of the way that bodies are made during development and because of how chromosomes be the result. And that it doesn't necessarily mean taking away someone's reproductive right, is going to be the answer. So I would even push back on that label. Okay, sorry. Any questions? Yes.
For the teachers and for anyone who can answer this on the floor, how do you see SPU changing in its inclusion for just diversity in general? Because SPU is labeled as a private Christian college, and you mentioned earlier that I think teachers aren't supposed to come out as or be out. In essence, so regarding this topic and just talking about this in classrooms, I think what is your hope, or how can students and teachers both create this space, the safe space to talk about these issues on our campus?
Sorry, I know I'm a student, but from the student perspective, and I also work in the Office of Admissions, that's why I couldn't be here earlier. So I get that unique perspective too. In my opinion, I feel like a lot of SPU's progress is mostly with their performativity. I heard someone's now. Like just a few years ago, like the whole reconciliation conversation wasn't a thing. Like, I have a family who has graduated from here, and this whole conversation is actually really new. Like, even like my first year was like it just being implemented. And that's because of a group of Black and brown students that came together and created something called the Justice Coalition, which is why Dr. Bailey's here. But it seemed like, that movement was kind of co-opted by the university, and it was changed. The idea of reconciliation and progress was changed and molded to fit the interests of the whole university, and both financially, socially, whatever. So from what I've seen and and as a person who's being fed all of these things, a lot of it is they learn these new language, like these new words, these terms, these languages, and these very basic concepts, but they don't really, like, things like racial reconciliation and feminism, like they know what the words are, but they don't understand the lineage of it or the history or who started these movements in the first place or the different applications of these theories. So it's a very surface level thing, and they try to make it look pretty, but the point of these movements is it isn't pretty, it's violent, and it's chaotic. And it needs to be, unfortunately, because of the system that we're in. So I feel like with these movements of progress, especially with like feminism and like gender inclusivity and race, and like how all those things are actually compacted into like one whole thing, they try to make it look as pretty as possible while saying step into the like discomfort. But then what their level, what SP's level of discomfort is it's not really uncomfortable at all. It's just learning how to think critically for the first time. So like woohoo, brownie points. But yeah, so honestly, I feel in a way, I kind of wish people would just be honest and just straight up be like transphobic or misogynist, because at least that way, students like me who are queer, brown, and non-binary, we can actually just like check out and protect ourselves. Because with all this performativity and all this like misuse and irresponsible use of theory and ideologies, it's really violent, because then these movements are being co-opted by people who shouldn't be using these theories for themselves in the first place. So yeah, that's my little.
Does Haven still exist?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Vice President.
Oh, awesome. Great. I was invited to speak at Haven. They would like have a trans panel or a trans day. No, it's usually in May. So like April and May. So it was in the spring, like years ago. And I remember there was this one year when the administration here was threatening to pull all funding, so they wouldn't actually be able to meet in a room. And it was great to see a lot of the student body come together to support that club so that it can continue to exist, to continue to have funding, to have a sponsor, and a faculty sponsor. So I haven't been invited in a couple of years, but I'm glad to hear that it's still existing. So that's great. Nice. Yeah, and I would say, this is where you get to take action and band together. Like you all should petition and say, y'all should be funding Haven. The campus should be funding Haven and making sure.
We got funding in 2016.
Did you?
Yes, we are a full club now, and we do get funding.
Okay. My work is done.
Our voices are heard on campus. It's another question.
That's great.
Anything else to say? Oh, how about two more? Is that okay? 2 more questions? Yes, ma'am.
So, your wonderful question about diversity. This is a question for the faculty members. There's so much talk about diversity. What do conversations among the faculty, especially like formal group meeting, whatever, look like when everyone is expected to be cisgender and straight? And I use air quotes because statistically, honestly, it's impossible. Maybe, I don't know. Anyway, how does that look like, and how do you have these conversations without members?
I'll speak for sociologists, sure. Dr. McKinney should be on the stage, by the way, but she happens to be in the audience. But in the sociology department, I'll say, even if the conversation is casual around gender, gender identities, or sex, or the politics of sex, I think I'm sort of new here. But from what I've seen, it's like it's always supportive of what students want, what students want to claim, how students want to push back against the administration, against rules on campus and expectations and so on and so forth. So I think, at least in our department, it's very positive. It's a very positive conversation where faculty are very aware that students.
are genes that get to be turned on or off at different parts of your life. You can actually end up mixing and matching all of these different anatomical parts. And that is actually, should not be that surprising for those of you who love biology, because there really are no shortage of options when it comes to the body. I tell my students that I'm going to say something always happens, but that's never true. There are always different things that are going to happen and different things. So the first type of option that we have are the chromosomes that a developing embryo might end up with. And of course, if you talk about a 46 chromosome individual, you might talk about a 46 chromosome individual who has 44 autosomes and 2 sex chromosomes. And sometimes those chromosomes are XX and sometimes those chromosomes are XY, but you have lots of other options. You can have XO, so you have 1X, so you have 45 chromosomes. You can have XXY, so you have 47 chromosomes. You can have XYY. So even at the genetic level, even at the number of chromosome levels, you don't just have 2 options. You have lots of different options, even at the very beginning of mixing and matching the number and style of chromosome that you're going to have. You can also mix and match gonads, so you can have 2 ovaries or 2 testes. You can have 1 ovary and 1 testy. You can have groups of cells you can have 2 half ovary, half testes in your body, and so you can again mix and match the gonads. You can mix and match genitalia. You can have a uterus and a penis, for example, and you can mix and match gonads and genitalia, so you can have ovaries and a penis, or testes and a labia, vagina. So we can mix and match genitalia, we can mix and match gonads, and there isn't sort of this, you have all or nothing. I should also say, well, I guess I can say this in a second, but for the first pass at thinking about this information, even if you were, for example, an XX woman who had ovaries, a uterus, a vagina, it might not look like somebody else's uterus and vagina, right? Or if you're an XY male and you do actually have testes and a penis, it might not look like somebody else's penis. And so even if you're going to say that your genitalia and your gonads are working in some way with a certain type of chromosome type, there are so many options for what that genitalia is going to look like and how it's going to go with the gonads that are either inside your body or outside. Often you might say that testes are outside of the body, but they're not, right? Often testes are actually housed inside of the body, and only the penis is outside for some people. And so there are lots of ways to be a person is going to be the sum of my argument. So this is, you guys see this okay? I don't think I have a way of lightening this too much up here. This is a developing fetus, a developing human fetus. And during development, as a body is being made, as limb buds are being formed, I study locomotion, and so I'm really interested in when limbs develop in humans. This is what the internal anatomy of a developing fetus looks like. It has all sorts of options. And one of the reasons we can mix and match genitalia and gonads and bodies is because at the beginning you have all of these different options. And so here you have a cloaca, so that's just going to be the opening through which waste product comes. And we have a Wolffian duct here in blue, and that often becomes something like a ductus deferens, seminal vesicle, different parts of what would be sort of a typical male style internal reproduction. You see your bipotential gonads, which have the tissue that could become ovaries or testes or some sort of ovitestes. And you're going to see the metanephros, which is going to become kidneys. And here you can see the ureter coming down. And so you can talk about this as bipotential. Some people call it sort of all potential. This is an organism that has all of the different pieces that can differentiate into lots of different options as you move through development. And so this is going to be 4 weeks post-conception. You're going to have something post-fertilization. You're going to have something like this. And then different choices are going to be made for this creature depending on decisions that are made by a whole set of pathways and genes. And this is a taste. This is a taste of what some of those pathways and genes look like. And you can imagine how turning on and off some of these pathways will take you into that mixing and matching framework that we just looked at. So here we have our little bipotential. You can see that even getting that set of anatomy, the Mullerian duct, the Wolffian duct, the cloaca, even that was a set of 7 different transcription factors that had to turn on genes, on chromosomes in exactly that region at exactly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, etc. days post-fertilization. So once these decisions of these 7 genes are made, you will end up with your bipotential gonad, assuming everyone has all of those genes in play. Then you have options based on whether or not you have 2 copies of X or whether or not you have an X and a Y chromosome or some iteration of other options that we've already looked briefly at. And then if you're going to turn on certain genes, you might end up differentiating those gonads into ovaries, or differentiating those gonads into a testes, or differentiating those gonads into part ovary, part testes in our different areas. And then once that happens, part of the job of those little cells is to start making hormones. And those hormones could be some version of testosterone, some version of dihydrotestosterone, some version of estradiol, some version of progesterone. And then depending on the job of some of these hormones, we are going to then further differentiate our cells, turn on additional transcription factors in those cells only. And then by turning on genes in those cells, we might end up with certain shifts in the shape and style of all of our different ducts in this figure here. So,
may not always have the resources to express how they feel about certain things, but that we can actually try to support them in that way so that they can actually voice their discomfort with certain issues, certain policies, and support them the best we can. I'm sure you're in the department, that's also the case.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying not to say anything. I know my department, but like, YRSPU has many issues surrounding this. So, I mean, we're coming from more progressive departments on campus, but even so, I mean, my department's not incredibly diverse. So I think part of the conversations that do happen, which are great, are knowledge-based, because there are ways to study and you can listen to the theories that are out there. But wider campus speaking, I think it's a struggle because even it's not those voices are not only kind of unwelcome to be a part of the faculty, but it's a struggle just even want to listen to those voices or student voices when you all say this is a change. So I mean, it's difficult to have those conversations. I think the first step is people have to be willing to do some work, which is kind of what tends to happen. Is like, oh, I don't know anything. I'm like, oh, like you have a PhD which taught you how to do research. So they can happen. You don't necessarily have to have, an identity to understand it, but you do have to be willing to do research on it, right? So now you know I was trying to.
I want to piggyback on that just a bit, though, because I think sometimes in academia we just get sort of locked into the theory. Like I can go and read this, and now I know the terminology, but I don't know, the question of how does it affect my personal life? And I guess I feel like this is a total generalization, so I'm sure it'll be false in areas. Maybe it's easier to have those theoretical knowledge conversations than it is for some individual to say, I am personally, like, my child is trans. Those sort of, I don't feel like we have those more personal conversations quite as much, and I wonder how the conversation might change if the theory and the experience were kind of matched up a little bit more. again, huge generalization, and probably not correct.
No, I mean, I get what you're saying. I think people need to emphasize. This is why I direct them towards literature, though, because you can do that without drawing someone emotionally first. But I think that that's the only unfair part is like, we want you on campus so that we can feel like it matters, but like we don't. Like, I came here and I love my colleagues, but like immediately, like every other white person that was like, let's go to lunch. I'm like, you need a black friend, so. But they're okay. It's good, it's important to have those relationships, but like, there's a first step, right? And I think that I'm always weary because I know what it's like to have your personal experience pulled on for someone to learn. And there's just not enough, like, people to go around for you to have a relationship for the politics to matter, you know? Like, you can be a man that fights, like, for women's reproductive rights and not have that personal experience. So I think that, like, yeah, I'm always going to point you in that direction. That's because I'm an exhausted one.
That's good, yeah.
One last question? Levi.
So you all touched, a couple of you touched on this already, but like with this new incoming like wave of passive progressivism and like the co-opting social change movements, what do you feel the upcoming generation of voices need to hear to kind of eliminate some of these false narratives to build like ideologies and actions to actually progress this conversation for like gender equity and representation?
It's a heavy hitter, Levi.
I'm just going to put one more shameless plug for me. If you call yourself an intersectional feminist, obviously read Crenshaw, but read The Company River Collective. Like, if you are interested in something, do the work to know what it's about. If you haven't read that, don't call yourself. No. I mean, read it and then do it. You know, I think, like, those... And Joy James, that essay, I tried to make everyone. I feel like Catherine's the only one I, like, proselytized to. I made her read all this stuff. Because that essay is all about how liberal feminism kind of overtakes. So we have these images of being super revolutionary, but the political content isn't really there anymore. So I think the more we understand how these things have happened, the more we can undo them. But again, I'm very biased, so that's my field.
I'll say briefly, we're almost out of time, but I'm going to talk about this next week in my class. Not everyone is invited because we don't have enough room, but can show up. But I like to talk about, you know, how feminism can be co-opted so easily. Almost everyone calls themselves a feminist, right? But it's also costless to call yourself a feminist because you didn't go through all the trials and tribulations that it took to be here, right? To be able to say that without being ostracized. See what I mean? It's a club where the cost of entry is very low, if not free, right now, right? That's a problem too, in a sense, right? That makes it so that a lot of people can claim to be without actually demonstrating that they are, right?
I would say, especially because in my circles, like talking about anything that has to do with like liberation or anything is like always like the main thing we're talking about, and honestly, it's like tiring. So I would probably say to chill out. Like, I feel like it's become such a competition to see who's more knowledgeable about these things, but people's knowledge don't come from anything further than like a Facebook post or like an article on medium.com. And so, yeah, honestly, just chill out and open a book if you're able to. Like Dr. Beatty's been saying, like, honestly, just keep reading and to really understand like the root of all of these things and like, expand yourself in that way. And yeah, and don't tie yourself out.
Oh, I think we are actually done with questions. This time we're 8 minutes over. But I would hopefully you guys will stay after the colloquium to be able to answer questions anyone who wonder if you guys want to come and listen. Please come forward. I'd like to give a big round of applause. We have to go through the set of pathways that's going to make hormones. We have to go through the set of pathways that's going to make hormones in very particular areas at very particular times. We have to have receptors for those hormones in order for those hormones to have any mechanism of action in particular cells. And all of those things are just not always true, or they're true in different amounts at different times for different humans in development. And so because of that, we end up with lots of different options in how we're going to turn on and off. Internal genitalia, external genitalia, and where different openings will be. It's very easy, for example, the vagina ends up being a part of these two ducts merging together. And a lot of people, when those ducts merge together, they actually leave a little septum, like the septum in your nose. And so again, you can be an XX vagina-holding woman who has a septum down the center of her vagina. That is normal variation. Okay? So not all vaginas look the same, not all penises look the same, and we're going to mix and match them in a couple of different ways. So that takes care of some aspect of the biology of what is happening in the abdomen. Additionally, whether or not you're making hormones in these areas, whether or not you have receptors for those hormones in these areas, you also have other glands in the body that make the exact same hormones. And so if you turn on genes in the testes for testosterone, that's fine. You might not be making receptors for that hormone in the testes, but you are making receptors for those elsewhere, and you're also making testosterone here in the adrenal gland. So even if testes don't form, even if ovaries form, the production of testosterone by the adrenal gland in a different part of the body will have effect on what external genitalia will look like, what beard growth looks like, what testosterone can do to myosin and actin in your skeletal muscle, and so you can end up again with a pretty interesting mixing and matching of morphology elsewhere in the body. So these are not the only interesting hormone-producing areas of the body, and you can have talking between the adrenal gland and the testes and the ovaries, and you can have definitely not talking between those, and we can see a lot of mixing and matching here as well. Now, these are just some options in terms of what we might put little check boxes for when we're trying to assign human people biological sex. This has really nothing at all to do with what any of these hormones actions we're having on the brain. And so the brain is an entirely different tissue. It has different hormones acting on it. It has barriers preventing or encouraging hormones to enter the brain. And so what is happening in the penis does not actually tell you very much about what's happening in the brain. And it's very easy from a physiological perspective to explain why people might have genitalia that looks one way and a brain that looks in the mirror and sees something else. Because what is happening in the brain is a different set of genes, a different set of receptors, and the brain also has antagonists so that it can be in control of what hormones are changing, neuronal shape, etc. So that is just a little tiny taste, and that was 20 minutes. Thank you, Andy, for giving me 20 minutes. Well done in your planning. And then I will be around after, but hopefully this gives you guys just a little bit of some words and a sense of sort of what questions you might want to ask later. And thanks. Might move on, Richard. Did everybody get the sheets of paper that hasn't passed around? Anybody has not? Okay. I'll figure it. Did anybody have the cards? I'll bring over there then. Can you get started?
I don't want to interrupt if you had a thing to say, but I can introduce myself. Okay. Hi, my name is Elaine Wiley. I am the co-executive director and co-founder of Gender Justice League. I've got a cold, but I can project, so you're going to hear a lot of resonance, kind of gravelly, but everyone in the back should be able to hear me, and if you can't, definitely raise your hand. If I say something like a term like the word cisgender, who doesn't know what the word cisgender means? Okay, if you're like, what was that word? I would be happy to interrupt myself if you just raise your hand. Okay, cisgender is a person who is, and thanks to all the information that we just had, they were born and their parents saw their body, their doctor saw the body, identified them as, for example, male, and then as that person grew up, they saw themselves as male and were comfortable with that gender. That's cisgender. Cis, the prefix meaning to not to cross, effectively. Trans meaning to cross. So transgender would be the opposite of cisgender. So when you hear cisgender or cis, C-I-S, that term refers to people who are not trans. And it would be helpful for you to understand some other forms of terminology. Trans, transgender, those are pretty synonymous today. A lot of folks will use either one of those terms. Tranny, T-R-A-N-N-Y, is a pejorative. It was in use in some cultures and some communities historically, but it is not a word you would want to speak or write today unless you were trying to be pejorative, and definitely a person that people don't want to be around. Anyway, other words that were historically we remember, transsexual, and that word has gone out of effectively fashion because that at some point, again, we've just done this whole idea of separating sex and gender out scientifically. We saw that, and by the way, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you for that. Like, I want to videotape that. I want a copy of this, and then I'll anyway. But what's that?
We got it.
Oh, great. We're all videotaped.
Get your coffee.
What's that?
You can get your coffee.
Thank you. So when we're hearing these terms that come up, we'll also hear terms like non-binary. We'll hear gender queer, gender non-binary, we'll hear gender non-conforming, and some of these terms refer to, again, there is a biological component, but it is mostly the brain of the person that's saying, the gender that I have been assigned, the story that my parents, grandparents, neighbors, friends, family, schoolmates, all of these people have about me isn't 100% correct. Or it's 0% correct. It's completely wrong, and here's who I am. Like me showing up at my 20-year class reunion saying, this is who I really am. Everyone's like, cool. I mean, I got a great response. I was graduated class of 90, lived up north in Shoreline School District, and I went to my 20-year class reunion, and I got to be myself. And I think the people around me, it was great to connect with them, because they're like, wow, you seem more yourself than you've ever been. I just didn't know who I was in high school. So that's some terminology. It's non-binary, makes sense? Is that okay, good. What is interesting at this moment in 2019 right now is that Washington State is one of a number of different states that all have non-binary gender markers for birth certificates, and we are moving towards having them for driver's licenses. And so that's really significant, and I had done some research and connected with folks at Pike Place Market. If you've been to the fish market, raise your hand. The fish market down there. Underneath that is the West Coast's oldest public bathroom. I learned that from the Pike Place Market staff. And what was fascinating about that was at the time, it was for men. It was just a bathroom. There was this assumption prior to first wave feminism that women were not allowed in public spaces. So if you had a public restroom, it was not for women. It was just a public restroom, and why would a woman use that? Because they wouldn't be out in public for very long. So what's interesting is that set of bathrooms currently in 2019 have male and female, or men and women. And awkwardly, they have set in the hexagonal tiles in the floor and the walls, XX and XY chromosome. It just says XX and XY in those bathrooms. And then above the doors, it says men only and women only. And I remember after I had transitioned in 2007, I remember going to that bathroom and I'm saying, well, gosh, I'm a woman, but that says XX, and I know I'm XY. So how am I going to do this? And I just said, well, what's on the floor and these tiles, that's not what's important. But we have this political moment where in 2019, non-binary gender markers exist, which begs the question, what's next for America? Because we are about 100 years out from single gender bathrooms. At some point, and I don't know when it happened, I don't know if it happened all at once or gradually, I'm assuming gradually, but First Wave Feminism said, hey, women deserve to be in public. That is something that is valid and rational, and we deserve to actually have bathrooms that are safe and separate from men's bathrooms. And so the invention of that, in America at least, led to the rise of bathrooms. And so we're all born and we went to schools that all had binary multi-stall bathrooms. And as we grow up, that's just what it is. That is the story of humankind, is that we have binary multi-stall bathrooms. How many people have been to Sweden? Anyone? You ever been to the bathroom in Sweden? What's that like? I'm saying, okay.
It's not based on gender. Everyone can just go in their individual stalls, so it's for everyone.
It was frustrating and exciting for me to go and watch a movie in a public theater, and I needed to go to use the restroom, and there was this extremely long line out the door. I'm like, what the hell? Apparently, in Sweden, everything is a line. There's a line for absolutely everything. But for the bathroom, it's a line for men and women. And you walk in, and the bathroom stalls are floor to ceiling. They're full walls. They're not that flimsy metal stuff with the little gaps. Who thinks the gaps? The gaps are terrible. And by the way, that's capitalism for you. We're going to make the walls as cheap as possible, with as many gaps as possible, get you in and out. So, but over there, socialism. Walks floor to ceiling walls with a locking door and a toilet inside. You know, you're starting to see that here in America. Now, in the city of Seattle, the previous mayor, Ed Murray, created a law that said if you have single-stall bathrooms in the city of Seattle, they have to be gender neutral. You cannot have a men's single-stall and women's single-stall. It's just single-stall bathrooms. And then signage that says, you know, all the different kinds of signage that you could think of. The sign with like pants on this side and dress on that side. You've seen those signs. You've seen the signs. How many people have seen the sign where it's just a person peeing and a person sitting? It's like, this is what you do in this room. That's what the sign is. But I think that's really interesting because we're trying to create or recreate or renew a society and the rules about society and the story about who people get together. You're my timekeeper, right?
Yes.
Okay, so make sure I know in 5 minutes, okay. And how many people have been inside the state of Washington since 2016? Okay, so you're familiar with Initiative 1515, maybe, or Initiative 1562. That was a set two, one in 2016 and one in 2017, statewide ballot initiatives that followed 6 bills that were introduced in the Washington legislature in January of 2016 that were designed to define gender and remove trans people from being able to use public restrooms based on the gender that they identify. It would basically say, and their targeted messaging said, if you allow trans women into women's bathrooms, then any man can claim that he is a woman and go in there and sexually assault your daughter, that's basically, or your wife, or your sister. And that was their targeted messaging. And what that did was, it said, they were pretending to say we're not attacking trans people, we're simply protecting our wives and our sisters and our daughters. But there was definitely a movement, and we had people inside. We had people that were signed up for some of their email lists that were actually, had trans people as sisters, wives, and daughters, so to speak, and that were following this and saying, hey, I want to know what they're saying. And so the public messaging was, we're just trying to protect women in those public bathrooms. But inside, in the private chat rooms, it was like, trans women are not women. Trans women are men. Not once did they ever talk about trans guys, trans men. Who are trans people who were masculine, who were born and grew up with a set of body parts that told the whole world, hey, I'm female, but their brain said, no, I'm male, and that person transitioned. And I thought that there was an interesting moment when, if those ballot initiatives had actually succeeded, it would have been putting trans masculine people that looked like they had beards, they looked like men, they were men, but they also appeared to be men, back into women's bathrooms. I'm thinking, so if so if a person wanted to go into a public bathroom and assault women, he's like, no, I'm supposed to be here. Like, look, I'm a trans guy. And I thought, your messaging is terrible. Fortunately, they didn't succeed. But it affected probably 50,000 trans people in this state. There were trans people in the Tri-Cities, in Spokane, Clark County, Bremerton, Bellingham, Mount Vernon. Trans people, and of course all over Tacoma, Olympia, Seattle regions, that were calling in and panicking. They were like, I don't know what to do. My child is being bullied at school because of the very existence of these ballot initiatives. The very fact that somebody is standing at Walmart with the ballot thing, and please sign it and I'll get $1. That was creating actual strife for these people. They were actually being bullied, they were being harassed. There was this idea and a story that trans women aren't women. And again, remember, trans men, completely silent. There was never a talk about that. They never addressed people who are intersex, they never addressed non-binary people. They literally were just attacking trans women. So that was the political moment that we had in 2016. We know that they felt emboldened and empowered to have that conversation here in Washington State because of other states. We saw this happen, I believe, was it Dallas? Houston? It was in Texas. Pretty terrible with which city it was. But we know that happened in 2015. We've seen it on the East Coast. We've seen it repeated in different states all over. And it's the same kinds of conflict and strife that we've seen for the last 20 years, similar to marriage equality. Marriage equality passes in this state. 5 other states pass laws prohibiting marriage equality. And you had this patchwork of states where you could get married if you were lesbian, gay, or bi. So now here we are in 2019, we seem to be past most of that issue. Anchorage, I think, was the most recent one where they had a ballot initiative, and I don't believe it passed. But it's 2019, and I think the next frontier for us to recognize, and it's been 100 years since we've done this, is to figure out what's next. Who do people actually get to be in the world? Do they get to be merely, and I'm pointing at this because I'm just referencing your amazing PowerPoint, do they get to be merely the sum total of the chromosomes, genes, cells, and mitochondria, and the bodies and body parts? Is that who people are? Or, as my brand new colleague has suggested, is that the brain is actually in control. The brain is who you are, or the brain is more clearly attached to who you are as a person. Like, I like the koan of like, where do you live in your body? And it's like, is it in your head? Is it your heart? You know, it's like, well, I mean, remove either of those and you're definitely done for. But no, it's, I mean, because you are who you are, and you are the sum total of all those experiences, and you are more than the sum total of your body parts. You get to choose as a sapient human being, like how you are going to move through the world. And I just think there's this interesting notion of, like the struggle that I have with my stepdad. He still uses he, him, and his pronouns. The change is now, like a decade on, that my mom is the one that will immediately correct him. And that's always amazing. And sometimes if he's just not getting it, and maybe he's gotten on in years, and maybe he's just struggling with putting all those thoughts together, that's fine. But it's really great to hear. He'll go, yeah, he went to the store and got some ice. Oh, she did she? And it's really great. But through that decade-long struggle with my own stepdad, I developed this idea, this notion that who am I to you? Do I get to be myself to you? Or do I merely get to only live as a version of how you see me? What's more important in the world, how I see myself or your opinion of how I am? And I would argue that there's a fundamental selfishness in only seeing the world through your own eyes and not being able to see people for who they really are, who they see themselves as. Like, I don't want to just stand up here and look female. I want you to acknowledge that I am female. I have that life. I went through my entire life, from 0 to 5. I don't really know what my experiences were, but I remember as soon as I figured out dresses, I was in them. That's who I was. I was like, yeah, of course. Not just because it was a triangle of, with a hole here and 2 holes here. Not just because of that, but it was like what it signified. Like, yeah, that's who I am. I didn't have language for that. I was 5. It was 1977. It was a long time ago, and there was not language around that. How am I doing? No, I meant. Time for a sip of water. But it wasn't until about when I was 10 when I went, there's a disconnect between my body and what my body is telling me and what my external body is telling me and what my family is telling me and what that little M on my birth certificate is telling me. There's a disconnect between that and what I know to be true. And that was 1982. And I've got to tell you, like the card catalogs. Remember the card catalogs? Have you ever seen one? Those giant, massive things with all the little drawers. There is not, in 1982, in Seattle, Washington, a middle school, a high school, a college campus, or a public library that had information on trans people. Apparently, and Marcia Botzer, who founded Ingersoll Gender Center in 1977, told me that you had to go to a book called Abnormal Psychology to find information about trans people at that time. And she knows that because she would spike that book with pamphlets for Ingersoll Gender Center. So if you figured out that you had to go to that book, you would go, oh, cool. And then that's how literally a lot of people found Ingersoll Gender Center, was finding a flyer in that book, hidden in that book. Brilliant. That's a trick for you all, so if you want to get messages out. Anyway. So I just think it's really weird. We're in such a really interesting place. And I know the talk is on feminism, and I really wish that my colleague Toby Meyer was here. She is my co-executive director. She's also like an expert on feminism. She did a lot of cultural feminism studies around like trans inclusion in feminism. She gave me a primer on first wave, second wave, third wave, and fourth wave, or so-called third wave and so-called fourth wave. But I love the ideas, and I can't stand up here and talk deeply about classic feminism. But I can talk about my personal experiences and my professional experiences, standing in front of audiences, sometimes feeling like this is a petting zoo, like you're going to get about 30 to 90 minutes of trans for your career, for your college education. And if I'm coming in front of a company, you're going to get about 90 to 120 minutes of trans, kind of in a setting like this, where I come and talk, and then that's it. There's just nothing. It's just the furry, fuzzy rabbits that you petted, and it was a good experience, but what are you going to take home with you? And so in 2018, I began to challenge myself and my audiences to go a step further. you already came this far to this room. And the challenge in front of you is now that you have some really incredibly packaged information about the biology and kind of the why is there diversity, human diversity, is that, like, now what do you do with that information? And the challenge in front of you is how do you incorporate that into your collegiate life? Like, what do you want to do with that information? What do you want to go on and do? I worked with folks who, and I helped develop a course at University of Washington Medical School. That's a health elective around trans health. And so we would get doctors, nurses, and mental health, like social work, mental health, psychologists, psychiatrists, folks that wanted to do work in counseling, chemical dependency, those kinds of folks. And they would sit in these classes and it was like, you have a challenge in front of you. Now that you've taken this class, and maybe you just signed up because it was an available elective, but now you have information out there that is super valuable. And what are you going to do with it? And this could challenge who you are professionally. It could challenge who you are spiritually. You know, I've been a part of a lot of conversations around where are trans people in the Bible? And how valid are trans people in existence? And it's absolutely clear that trans people have always existed. My wife is Native American. She hails from the Colville tribe. And in that tribe, they have 5 recognized genders. After colonialism and colonization, mostly and I don't want to go into the denominations of it, but mostly the religious, well, the white colonizing religious leaders were oppressing, punishing, destroying the idea of more than 2 genders. And that's been going on for 500 years. That kind of eradication of gender and conformity of gender has been going on North America, Central America, South America for 500 years. So the politics of gender is 5 centuries old. And when people actually get to be who they are at the very core and the very root, that's really powerful. Like, what would it be like to have 5 recognized genders? And that's just one tribe. What would that look like? That's pretty powerful. My advice to the city of Seattle, to the state of Washington, to Parks and Recreation, is that you're going to be, and to the city of Bellevue most recently, was you're going to be building buildings. And you're going to be putting bathrooms in these buildings. And all those bathrooms need to conform to a building code. There's a health code related to the plumbing. And so I said, here's the action that you get to take, City of Bellevue. Is like, before you build another building, before you remodel another building, you should evaluate where people are at. Multiple genders exist. Why not create a facility that is welcoming, that has the signs that say, hey, no matter what gender you are welcome in this space. Why not create a building that says, hey, it doesn't matter what gender you are, there's a toilet for you and a sink for you to use, and that weird dry thing that everyone says is actually just spreading germs around. You can use that no matter what gender you are, you know? And it isn't, don't put the toilets in, create the signage, create a story that says, hey, no matter what gender you are, you matter. You are important. I'll close with this. In 2014, I spoke to a group of 5th to 8th grade girls at the Seattle Girls School. And I remember it was really a really powerful moment. And a girl raised her hand and said, what do I do? She said, what do I do when my aunt says that I'm just going through a phase? I told her I like girls, and she says, it's just a phase. And it says, you know, who you are right now matters. Who you are what you're creating for yourself, the story that you're telling about yourself, that matters. And as far as a phase goes, remember, they love you, but they've already been creating this story from before you could talk. So who you are right now matters, but also every version of yourself. Every possible version and every iteration of yourself matters all along the way. So it isn't just some sort of weird outcome, like the end of some book that it's only half written, but like page 37 right now, you matter. And so I want to leave you with that thank you for listening to my story and my stories about trans people in Washington State. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hopefully we will save the Q&A afterwards. Wonderful. And now we're going to move on to the panelist portion of this colloquium. We have my co-leader helping us some chairs, so you guys can come up. I think I just gave somebody, when I was moving the papers, my questions were the kids in the ball. Yeah. And just to clarify, everyone got one? The yellow piece of paper has quick definitions that we had gotten either just from our own collective memories. We didn't like a definition online, or from a book that's linked in the bottom, which is the free PDF. But it's called The ABCs of LGBT+, by Ashley Mardell. The YouTuber is now known by Ash Cardell. So the dead name, but I would encourage everybody to look or get this book. It has a complete current definitions of sexualities and genders, and kind of just, and it's free. You can go online. I think I'm a chair. The chair? You can have a stool. Here. Thank you. Hello. And so I would encourage everybody to look it up online, and just to encourage continued education beyond this, and not just educate yourself, but be part of these initiatives like bathroom bills. You see things like the Nashville Statement, you see things that go on in like the more politically correct. Take initiative, even if it's beyond your own identities. And welcome, panelists. Hello. Let's introduce with their names, your pronouns if you'd like, and your department, and maybe an introduction on your study or how it relates to feminism across all genders. Another way you'd like to approach that. I'll go first. My name is Andy Spalletta, they, them pronouns. I'm a cultural studies major, and I am the president of the SJC major committee. If you want to know more, come at me. I'm going to pass to Dr. Mondesir.
I'm Raphael Mondesir in sociology. He and him, so conventional, it's kind of boring. And my area of study is community development in sociology. It's really about representation. So it has a lot to do with the role of women in community development and initiatives for collective action in the Global South. So that's how I tend to think about gender and the politics of sex as well in that context.
I'm Sarah Koenig. I'm in the School of Theology. Old Testament is my focus, but within that I've been doing reception history, which studies how particular texts have been received or interpreted throughout time. My book just came out. I'm super excited about it. It took a really long time. My daughter and her friend were talking about a Harry Potter book a while ago, and she was like, my mom wrote a book, and the friend said, how long did it take you? And I said, 12 years. So, but the book is Bathsheba Survives. So I was looking at how David's wife Bathsheba was received over the centuries. It is on Amazon. Yeah. We have to support one another. It's so important to get your book out there. I appreciate that. So she, her pronouns, and yeah, I think I've working with Bathsheba's character for a long time, but broadly very interested in personal experience as well about women in religion and in the church. So I'm more focused on that. And then, how that affects my view of gender and my experiences with gender as well. Yeah.
Alright, I'm Elena Bailey. I am pronouns she, her. I'm in the English and Cultural Studies department, but I'm coming from a cultural studies background more so. I actually joke that I have not a single degree in English. I do have a PhD in literature and cultural studies, but my degrees are in physics and then Spanish and Latin American studies. But a bachelor's before you get too excited. So I do a lot in both Black studies and women and gender studies. That's really my background. Part of what and I did my doctoral research on different forms of Black feminist thought.
And so one of the reasons why you guys were particularly asked to join this panel is because students, particularly in the LGBTQ and marginalized genders have taken classes by you and saw you guys as leaders at the school. And part of being at SPUs, you cannot have professors who are out as LGBTQ. We are first-degree Methodists, but we know that Christianity as a whole, there's a lot of dominations who don't allow women in leadership, and yet we're having women in roles of professor, women lead classrooms. And a lot of times you bring in more than yourself, more than these just stated identities. You're bringing in backgrounds with knowledge and basis of meeting people that a lot of us come from very particular backgrounds, either small, tight-knit communities in SoCal or like me from the Bay Area and have been able to be out as a non-binary person for a very long time. And so you're getting a lot of students here coming here with different backgrounds, different areas of knowledge. And with that, my question is like, how do you go on teaching in your discipline, teaching with people with different backgrounds, feminist concepts that isn't binary? So who wants to start?
Sure, I'll go. It's actually one of my favorite sections to discuss, to engage students in discussion with in class, especially the power and privilege. Usually what I like to do is I sort of go at it sideways, just coming from intersectionality to get into non-binary feminism. So I like to start with a speech by Sojourner Truth, I believe 1861 in Akron, Ohio, which is entitled, that speech is entitled, "Am I a Woman?" In that speech, she's basically problematizing the whole issue of who counts as a woman, right? Who is a woman? So she's challenging the conventional idea that a woman is basically a white woman, right? So Sojourner Truth is a black woman born in slavery. All her children were born in slavery. Yet she's at this convention speaking on the behalf of women. She's posing this very problematic, very politicized question: am I a woman? And then and I engage with discussion in the class with this, and then we transition from that to non-binary feminism, because we can replace the race category with anything else. Right? We can replace the race category. She's female and black, but what if she wasn't black? Or she is black, but we can add another category to it. Intersex, for example. Right? Or she's a lesbian. She identifies as genderqueer. What would that speech mean to people at that convention, or now, today, in 2018, 2019, right? So that's usually how I go about getting into that discussion of talking about non-binary feminism, that maybe feminism is not, just maybe, right? That it's not really the exclusive property or domain of heterosexual, cisgender women. Right? And that some other people who want to be counted as women should have a say in how feminism is actually defined, right? And this is when we get into a discussion of what feminism is for and what feminism is by as a movement, right? So what I mean by that is feminism, when we engage in activism, we can actually engage in activism on behalf of people. We always do, in a sense, right? Not just on our behalf, but also on behalf of other people. So feminism can be by certain people, for certain people, right? Now, who is in these categories? Who is it for, and who is it by? Is it only for a certain definition of womanhood, people who fit that definition? Is it only by women who only fit that definition? So I think that usually makes for interesting discussions. The other thing I try to do, to take too much time, the other thing I try to do is really try to do my best to assign readings from usually people who identify either as queer, genderqueer, lesbian, so on and so forth, who actually are writing and actually creating, producing research, producing knowledge in the field of either sociology or social studies. People like Judith Butler or Dorothy Allison, whose narrative is fascinating. People like Charlene Carruthers, activist, black women, who are people who fit in so many categories. And again, we can play with the categories in terms of where human beings fit, and we can start asking the question of who counts as a woman. Because it seems like there's a big debate on who counts as a woman. Are trans women real women, real women, right? Who is a real woman? So I think to me, that's an interesting discussion to have. And it always enriches our understanding of what non-binary feminism would look like. That's usually my approach.
I'm glad you went first, because when Andy sent me the questions, I actually, in all honesty, I thought, I don't know that I do that very well in the classroom. I don't know that I teach non-binary feminism in my classes well. So I'm just totally honest with that. Some of that might have to do with the subject material of teaching classes. If I think more broadly about women in the Bible, for example, I think there's so many different pictures, even though in the Old Testament the Old Testament isn't terribly interested in women, and they're very much objectified, marginalized, and so, but even with the narratives that are there, you see such a spectrum. So what does it mean to be a biblical woman? Well, maybe you killed someone with a tent peg, or maybe you're a mother of 7 sons, or whatever. So there's all sorts of different varieties of stories of women. And so I do hope that I can highlight that even in the intro classes, to say there's not just a single narrative about women in the Old Testament. If we read carefully and with maybe more openness to that might stretch our imagination a little bit more. Elena, I think you asked that question of, are there trans people mentioned in the Bible? It's a great question. I think there's ways we can read to be more affirming and to see these options as well. It just maybe takes a little more creativity in order to do it in that way. So, one other comment when Raphael was speaking about the offering readings from other perspectives. One thing I try to do in my You Found 2000 class, the Enter the Bible class, is we have these contextual readings where we get to read narratives or read interpretations of text from different perspectives. And your comment reminded me that this next quarter I want to make sure that there are some freer readings of biblical texts in that. I tend to get pushback. It's shifted over the years. When I first started teaching here as being a woman teaching Bible, that already was kind of a big barrier for certain students. And so I think just because of my field and my subject area, there's ways that I feel like I want to speak about things in maybe slightly more subversive ways, but then hopefully also as open and honest as I can to present perspectives that maybe a student would have heard from a particular faith background. So that's my non-answer.
Oh, we have 15 minutes, you're good. There's a little bit of confusion because we had Drew Cortez as part of the panelists prior to the multitude of word conflict. We had you doing the Q&A. Unless you want to join? Q&A, just further. All right. That's what I mean. Oh, and by the way, you do. I don't think sometimes it's hard to recognize things as feminist, but like even recognizing God with God's self, God pronouns versus he, him, or even seeing God not in the typical like mainstream of just either tan Jesus like you see in Viola's wall, or just this figure of a white man as top. And then sometimes we bring in different categories of people as representation, especially in religion, especially as like this higher power. You go that throughout the class, and that was something I was very thankful for. And bringing in all perspectives, biblical women versus women now. Like even those are two different genders, you could say. Genders change all the time. Different cultures, you can say that different cultures and ethnic groups will have different categorizations of these two women and men, and it doesn't have, even though the same words doesn't mean that's the same thing. So I saw that in your class when I had two kids, so I thought that was really appreciable. So I'm going to say that's a quick note.
Yeah. All right. That's a really good question. There's two primary ways I try to do this, and then the default to like, by nature of being cultural studies, most of the people are writing the essays that many of you have had to suffer through in my class on race and gender, are written by people of a number of gender and racial and sexual orientation. Like, this is the nature of the beast in my field. Like, people are experts in many different identities. But I tend to take one of two approaches. One is definitely you can approach it through the lens of intersectionality, which is really important. Although I just read an essay on this. One of my pet peeves is like today everyone is like, oh, woke intersectional feminist. And I'm like, but you don't know what intersectional is. You did a great job, but like, you know. Because it's not just like, how does womanhood meet race or class? It's a very particular thing. If you haven't read the Come By Huber Collective Statement, you should do that before you call yourself an intersectional feminist. But one of the reasons why is because intersectionality, first prototyped by Sojourner Truth. I was so impressed. I was like, wow, you can teach my course. But prototyped by Sojourner Truth, and later by the Come By Huber Collective, is thinking about building a society around the most marginalized group. And at the time of the Come By Huber Collective, it was these working class queer black women, right? Today, arguably, it would be working class transgender black women or women of color because of the, like violence rates. They tend to be arguably the most marginalized group in our society. So intersectionality is really about building a movement around those groups, because if you do it for them, I'm pretty sure the rest of us are going to be sitting pretty. You know what I mean? Like that's really the politics of intersectionality that sometimes gets lost. I think the other thing is, and I know Catherine over there has had to suffer through my discussions of just understanding fundamentally what feminism is and that there are different types. I think some of the confusion about associating feminism with a particular womanhood is, one, it's associated with women, and two, it's really a definition of liberal feminism that is so oriented in gender identity. But I made Catherine read Joy James, and I highly recommend Joy James. She wrote this amazing essay on what radical black feminism really is, and it's about orienting these politics towards the state, right? She has this really great quote where she says, the nemesis of radical feminism is political violence. So like rethinking feminism again about these politics of liberation and equality as opposed to something rooted in a very particular narrow definition of womanhood. And the last thing I'll say, and you also got to this, which is so great, is that a lot of this just coming from my work in black feminist thought is long-standing black feminists, theorists have not thought of gender as this binary. So Hortense Spillers has this amazing essay called Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe. I love the title, it's really creative. Again, an amazing theorist, but she really argues that from the moment that black women went into the transatlantic, they became a distinct gender formation. So it's not that they're women who happen to be black, but it's a separate gender identity. And that you can see that through the way that gender plays out in the US, particularly for black women. So thinking about gender already existing as the spectrum, as opposed to saying, there's cisgender and then there's these other genders, right? So it's always been more complicated than that. But I think that what we get kind of in our contemporary culture is this very narrow view of feminism that's centered in kind of like a white cisgender.
So that sort of touched on my next question I was going to ask, which is how have you seen feminism move away from cisgendered ideologies? We see feminism kind of constructed in these movements, like first wave, second wave, third wave, and so we don't, and then we like almost being micromanaged. Like we can't say we can't call ourselves radical feminists, or we have to use intersectional feminism, and all other feminisms is void now. So, but the point is moving away from like exclusionary practices, moving away from systems in which keep this like white patriarchal movement systems in place. How have you seen either mainstream or in your field collectively moving away from these like cis-centered or dominant these patriarchal systems from existing? Or at least thoughts.
Well, the good news is, I think, if I may answer first again, I'm such a dude.
We forced him to go, yeah. We're like, you sit over there, we want to go. Yeah, we can think of our answer.
I think the good news is, in recent years, I think there's been a lot more open discussion, not just among sociologists or social scientists and activists, but I think a lot more open conversation about what those identities stand for, like who fits under what letter in the LGBTQ alphabet soup, sort of, right? And how people sort of find their position there, and they will defend it as their turf. These conversations have become a lot more commonplace, which is good news, which is a good thing, right? That these conversations can happen. They don't have to be, they're still political, right? They don't have to be so loaded every single time I want to engage in these debates. And I think that's the good news. The bad news, from my perspective, is that there are some feminists who do not acknowledge certain individuals and certain groups as being worthy of being incorporated in the movement. And this split, this division within the movement, I think is very problematic. I'll give you a recent example. Germaine Greer, the feminist, who basically said that trans women or people who have transitioned are not necessarily, well, the term she used was something I'm not going to say and repeat here, but it was not very nice. It was not a very nice descriptive, saying that these people don't really count as women who we should fight on their behalf and who should count as part of the movement. Which again brings us back to the very definition of what woman is, what womanhood is, and who counts as that, but also really bringing up the politics of one's sex and sexual identity in ways that maybe we hope that we could have gone beyond by now, but we haven't. Right? So I think there's good news, but that's bad news in the sense that we're still stuck in talking about these gender identities and these sexual identities in ways that are more or less about the binary still. Right? We haven't gone past that. Because if you, like Germaine Greer, think that women who have transitioned, or men who have transitioned are not real women, or that women who have transitioned from women to men are gender traitors, then we're still stuck in the discussion about the binary. So in that sense, within the movement itself, we have a lot more work to do to get people to really understand that feminism is not, again, the exclusive turf of cisgender people. And people who identify with one necessarily conventional sexual identity or gender identity.
I feel like in biblical studies in particular, I get this image of, it's kind of like, the Mickey Mouse head with the two little ears. I feel like the conversations about feminism are sort of on still one of those ears where they're not really in the mainstream of, so if you do feminist biblical studies, that's its own thing anyway. It's sort of separate, and then even within that, I think the conversations are really fairly binary in theology and biblical studies. I do want to give a shout out to my colleague, Dr. McKinney, who has been doing some research in this area, yes, for all sorts of reasons, but so even some of what is out there written by Christians for Christians about transgender, there's really not a whole lot that is out there, and so there's a big gap in that area. So I think that maybe that's the good news, there's space to have those conversations. I do feel like sometimes within the church, the conversation is still like, again, can a woman teach a man? So we're kind of back having that conversation, which itself is sort of binary. But then, so I think we still have a ways to go, and hopefully can learn a little bit from our in different disciplines. And then I am curious to see what's going to be happening more broadly for the church in America since marriage equality. You know, I think there's some ways that politically we might start to shift some of our faith commitments as well. But again, I still feel like we're kind of in that area in the past.
Even I'm Episcopalian, but even there, you know, it's a very inclusive and affirming church, but even in like as a church that, you know, kind of like participates in trans remembrance day, it's still like the language is like, we can talk about, the language is still catching up. Talking about sisters and brothers, but we forget to change the language to be broader than that. Although people at least like working on stabilizing and opening up that articulation of God. But anyway, also unrelated, but I will afterwards tell you, I saw students online on Twitter like singing your praise about a statement online about how we see God and gender. So made me think of you. It was positive. They were like, she's amazing. She said this in class. So, I like to affirm one another. But I echo what you said, honestly. I think the good thing, I've talked to Andy and others, is that particularly, like those of your students, your generation, honestly, has pushed things forward. Like Gen Z's kind of commitment to not only like using certain terminology, but demanding that others use that appropriate terminology and identities has like moved things forward significantly. So keep doing that. I think that's a huge thing, honestly. I do think that there's a hurdle we have yet to cross, or yet to do it, particularly in those two ends of the spectrum of types of feminists who ironically say they want to destabilize gender, but still see feminism as tied to a particular gender identity, and then those who see it as about something else. So really, I think as we're moving forward, we have to get clear about like what our politics and our aims are, and like keeping that goals, because otherwise we're not going to get there. I do think though the movement to destabilize our understanding of gender is helping a lot, while also recognizing that it matters for people. I think that that's a fine line that we're still working out. We can't just say like gender is a construct; it doesn't matter. Because for people, there's life and death stakes on their gender identity, right? But I think we haven't had hard conversations within the community for those of us who identify as women, which we need to have. There's a big gap between where we are ideologically and what's happening on the ground, even in the academy. And there's famous kind of fights and news at conferences about who should be invited or who should not be invited because of their gender identity. So still working through it, I think. But I think the demand for inclusion is important. But I think we need to have more honest conversations about our politics and our issues. If we don't, we're not going to get there.
Thank you, Dr. Newman. Thank you, panelists, for our amazing conversation and amazing words. We have reached time, so I would encourage all the speakers to come up if you would like to open up to questions from all of you guys. Yes. So, yeah, if you have questions you might want to ask, I can always turn to questions I've prepared, but we would love for you guys to bring in your thoughts. Drew, would you like to participate in Q&A, or? Yeah, student responses. There's a stool for you, right here.
Hi, I'm Drew. I use he, they pronouns. I am on the SGC committee as a social media coordinator.
So, any questions?
So, I'm not sure if I can phrase this question correctly, but what would you say to the people of law enforcement then about gender identity?
Can you repeat the question?
What would you say to people in the law enforcement to
About gender identity.
I'm curious to ask about at what level? Is it at the level of a police officer apprehending civilians, or at the level of the state correctional facilities, or what level you're thinking?
I think I was thinking at multiple levels of the police officer and the state as well.
I'll start. I got the microphone on. Is that a good thing? Sure, great. Gender Justice League is currently working with a coalition around working with and advising on the rights of incarcerated trans people. And I know historically there have been a group that have come together to advise Seattle Police Departments and other police departments on how to engage with and interact with trans people, and to effectively make that a mandatory training for the SPD, so that they would be able to interact with trans people respectfully. They would be able to acknowledge folks, and especially in the reporting of crime publicly, they would be able to be respectful of a person's gender, especially when that person can't talk for themselves. For example, after somebody may have been killed, or if they're incarcerated and unavailable, the police spokespeople wouldn't be misgendering or dead naming a particular individual. Problem is that you also have the jail piece. So for King County jails, for several municipal jails, state and also federal, there are varying levels, widely varying levels of how they interact with and treat trans people. And that's endemic across the United States. That's still really a work in progress. But I know that there are at least one police department locally has pledged to do better. So, yeah.
Anybody else have anything? I would expand it towards one of the more mainstream conversations we're having with law enforcement and the police is racial justice and how police interact with people who aren't white. And I would include in that just that part of education, people who identify as LGBTQ, because trans people of color, particularly Black trans people, have high levels of being murdered, high levels of being incarcerated, and so their interactions with the police, or when the police interact with the family, is like understanding this kind of scenario, studying their situation and what's actually happening on, and getting out of that frame that they might be coming from if they are cisgender heterosexual. Any other questions?
Yeah, so I'm a dude, so probably cisgender male. Like, how can I best support women, like, as a dude? And I guess, like, the example that I would say is, like, abortion, which is controversial, and I'm sorry, but, like, I'm pro-life because I don't think anyone has rights until they have the right to live. But I'm also, like, pro-choice because I'm a dude and, like, I'll never have to bear a child. Like, I want to support women. Like, what is the balance of what can I do? I guess I just want to hear, like, what you guys would have to say.
As a fellow dude, I'll say stop. As a fellow dude, I'll say start where you are with the women around you. Sisters, they have siblings, and start where you are. You don't necessarily have to go and join the big march to prove that you support women, but if you do, that's great too. But you can treat women you encounter on a daily basis respectfully. Totally. You can do that. It's not that hard. You can do it. And you can encourage your other dude friends to do the same things. Yeah.
I'll just add, just because the nature of the question, which is a great one, is I think, because this is something that's really symptomatic in my field, is oftentimes we get caught up in our like ideological markets, which are very important. Those of you who know me know I want you to define your ideological beliefs in politics, but don't forget, like Raphael saying that on a lived grassroots level, that might look differently, and if there is kind of disconnect, sometimes being comfortable with that is a big part of that. Like if you're at a place where your personal beliefs are one thing, but your like politics of affirmation and inclusion mean that you support an ideology that maybe you don't agree with 100%, but that's what it looks like to exercise support, right? I mean, many of us vote for people or do things that we don't agree with everything, but that's kind of how politics and in practice work. So I think letting yourself live in that contradiction is an important part.
I mean, my answer, I'll qualify my answer a little bit, right, quickly. The reason I'm saying this is because I know for a fact, I know of guys who go to the women's marches, who say they support women in various ways, and yet in their interactions on a daily basis, you don't quite see that. That's what I'm saying. It's like, I'm not sure it's very helpful to claim that you support women when you don't actually treat women in the right way.
But it's also, I think, really important that doors are open for you and you're in conversations where there might not be any women. And it's what you say to men that is going to change minds. And so when you have that moment of privilege where someone is saying something about someone else's woman or sister or mother, that you say, that's not a joke, that's not funny. The more you say it, the more the neural pathway is laid down, so you think it's real. And that's not real. And so it's those words that you say in those situations that can be as important as you, as Raphael was saying, as you marching alongside head on.
I would also give one just a little note, sorry, I'm not that kind of, but is that pro-life doesn't necessarily mean all lives. If you sometimes taking away someone's right isn't going to heal the issue. We know that people will get abortions no matter what, it was legal or not. And the point is not taking away that right, but finding the underlying causes that might have people need these things. Because someone is assaulted, if you have misogyny, if you have transphobia, if you have people wanting to enforce systems of oppression, things like giving away something you might actually want, like a baby might